The joining of the signs. In the low-roofed smithy, Will stood with his back to the entrance, staring into the fire. Orange and red and fierce yellow-white it burned as John Smith pushed at the long bellows arm. The warmth made Will feel comfortable for the first time that day. There was no great harm in an old one being fish wet in an icy river. But he was glad to feel warm in his bones again, and the fire lit his spirits as it lit the whole room. Yet it did not properly light the room, for nothing that Will could see appeared solid. There was a quivering in the air, only the fire seemed real, and the rest might have been a mirage. He saw Merriman watching him with a half-smile. "It's the half-world feeling again." Oh, sorry, this is Will talking. "It's the half-world feeling again," Will said, baffled. "The same as today in the manor when we were in two kinds of time at once." "It is just the same, and so we are." But we're in the time of the smithy," Will said. "We went through the doors." So they had, he and Merriman, old George, and the huge horse Pollux, out on the wet, dark common, when the wild hunt had driven the dark away over the sky. They had gone through the doors into the time 6 centuries earlier, from which Hawken had once come, and into which Will had walked on the still snowy morning of his birthday. They had brought Hawken back to his century for the last time, borne on Pollux's broad back. When they were all come through the doors, old George had taken the horse away, bearing Hawken's body in the direction of the church, and Will knew that in his own time, somewhere in the village churchyard, covered either by more recent burials or by a stone crumbling into illegibility now, there would be a grave of a man named Hawken, who had died some time in the 13th century and lain there in peace ever since. Merriman drew him to the front of the smithy, where it faced the narrow, hard earth track through Hunter's Combe. "The old way. Listen," he said. Will looked at the bumpy track, the dense trees on the other side, the cold gray strip of almost morning sky. "I can hear the river," he said, puzzled. "Ah," Merriman said. "But the river's miles away on the other side of the common." Merriman cocked his head to the rushing, rippling sound of water. It had the sound of a river that is full but not in flood, a river running after much rain. "What we are hearing," he said, "is not the Thames, but the sound of the 20th century. You see, Will, the signs must be joined by John Wayland Smith in this smithy, in this time, for not long after this, the smithy was destroyed. Yet the signs were not brought together until your quest, which has been within your own time, so the joining must be done in a bubble of time between the two, from which the eyes and ears of the old ones may perceive both. That's not a real river we hear. It is the water running in your own time down Huntercombe Lane from the melting of the snow." Will thought of the snow and of his family, beset by floods, and suddenly he was a small boy wanting very much to be at home. Merriman's dark eyes looked at him compassionately. "Not long," he said. A hammering sound came from behind them. They turned. John Smith had finished pumping the bellows at his red-white fire. He was working at the anvil instead, while the long tongs waited ready before the fire's glow. He was not using his usual heavy hammer, but another that looked ridiculously small in his broad fist. A delicate tool more like those Will saw his father use for jewelry. But then the object on which he was working was far more delicate than horseshoes. A golden chain, broad-linked, from which the 6 signs would hang. The links lay in a row beside John's hand. He looked up, his face flushed red by the fire. "I am almost ready." "Very well, then." Merriman left them and stalked out to the road. He stood there, alone, tall and imposing, in a long blue cloak, the hood pushed back so that his thick white hair glinted like snow. But there was no snow here, even though the sound of the water that Will could still hear, even through the sound of the water that Will could still hear rushing. No water either. Then the change began. Merriman seemed not to have moved. He stood there with his back to them, his hands loose at his sides, very still, without the least movement. But all around him the world was beginning to move. The air shivered and quaked. The outlines of trees and the earth and sky trembled, blurred, and all things visible seemed to swim and intermingle. Will stood looking at this wavering world, feeling a little giddy, and gradually he began to hear, over the sound of the unseen rushing river road, the murmur of many voices. Like a place seen through a shimmering haze of heat, the trembling world began to resolve itself into outlines of visible things, and he saw that a great, indistinct throng of people filled the road and the spaces between all the trees, and all the open yard before the smithy. They seemed not quite real, not quite firm. They had a ghostly quality, as if they might disappear when touched. They smiled at Merriman, greeting him where he stood, his face turned away still from Will. Thronging round him, they gazed eagerly ahead at the smithy, like an audience about to watch a play. But as yet, none of them seemed to see Will and the smith. There was an endless variety of faces, gay, somber, old, young, paper white, jet black, and every shade and graduation of pink and brown between, vaguely recognizable or totally strange. Will thought he recognized faces from the party at Miss Graythorne's manor, the party in a 19th century Christmas that had led Hawk into disaster and himself to the Book of Grammari. And then he knew. All these people, this endless throng that Merriman had somehow summoned, were the old ones from every land, from every part of the world. Here they were to witness the joining of the signs. Will was all at once terrified, longing to sink into the ground and escape the gaze of his great new enchanted world. He thought, these are my people. This is my family, in the same way as my real family, the old ones. Every one of us is linked for the greatest purpose in the world. Then he saw a stir in the crowd, running like a ripple along the road, and some began to shift and move as if to make way, and he heard the music, the piping thrumming sound, almost comical in its simplicity, of the fifes and drums he had heard in his dream that might not have been a dream. He stood stiffly with his hands clenched, waiting, and Merriman swung around and strode to stand behind him, as out of the crowd toward them came the little procession just as it had before. Through the thronging figures, and curiously seeming more solid than any, came the little procession of boys. The same boys, in their rough, unfamiliar tunics and leggings, shoulder-length hair, and strange bunched caps. Again, those at the front carried sticks and bundles of birch twigs, while those at the back played their single repeated melancholy tune on pipes and drums. Again, between those two groups came 6 boys carrying on their shoulders a bier woven of branches and reeds, with a bunch of holly at each corner. Merriman said very softly, "First on St. Stephen's Day, the day after Christmas, then on Twelfth Night. Twice in the year, if it is a particular year, comes the hunting of the wren." But now Will could see the bier plainly, and even at the beginning this time there was no wren. Instead, that other delicate form lay there, the old lady, robed in blue, with a great rose-colored ring on one hand, and the boys marched up to the smithy and very gently laid the bier down on the ground. Merriman bent over it, holding out his hand, and the lady opened her eyes and smiled. He helped her to her feet. Moving forward towards Will, she took both his hands in hers. "Well done, Will Stanton," she said, and through all the crowd of old ones thronging the track, a murmur of approval went up, like the wind singing in the trees. The lady turned to face the smithy, where John stood waiting. She said, on oak and on iron let the signs be joined." "Come, Will," said John Smith. Together they moved to the anvil. Will laid down the belt that had borne the signs through all their seeking. On oak and on iron," he whispered. "Iron for the anvil," said the smith softly. "Oak for its foot. This big wooden base of the anvil is always oak, the root of an oak, strongest part of the tree. Have I not heard someone telling you the nature of the wood a while ago?" His blue eyes twinkled at Will, and then he turned to his work. One by one he took the signs and joined them with the rings of gold. In the center he set the signs of fire and water. On one side of them the signs of iron and bronze, and on the other the signs of wood and stone. At each end he fastened a length of sturdy gold chain. He worked swiftly and delicately, while Will gazed. Outside, the great crowd of old ones was still as growing grass. Behind the tapping of the smith's hammer and the occasional hiss of the bellows, there was no sound anywhere but the running water of the invisible river road, centuries away in the future and yet close at hand. "It is done," said John at last. Ceremonially he handed Will the glittering chain of linked signs, and Will gasped at the beauty of them. Holding the signs now, he felt from them suddenly a strange fierce sensation like an electric shock, a strong, arrogant reassurance of power. Will was puzzled. Danger was past, the dark was fled, what purpose had this? He walked to the lady, still wondering, put the signs into her hands, and knelt down before her, but she said, "But it's for the future, Will, don't you see? That is what power the signs are for. They are the second of the four things of power that have slept these many centuries, and they are a great part of our strength. Each of the things of power has made a different point in time, was made at a different point in time by a different craftsman of the light to await the day when it would be needed. There is a golden chalice called the Grail. There is the circle of signs. There is a sword of crystal and a harp of gold. The Grail, like the signs, is safely found. The other two we must yet achieve, other quests for other times, but once we have added those to these, then, when the dark comes rising for its final and most dreadful attempt on the world, we shall have hope and assurance that we can overcome." She raised her head, looking out over the unnumbered ghostly crowd of the old ones. "When the dark comes rising," she said, expressionless, and the many voices answered in a soft, ominous rumble, "6 shall drive it back." Then she looked down again at Will, the lines around her ageless eyes creasing in affection. "Sign-seeker," she said, "by your birth and your birthday you came into your own, and the circle of the old ones was complete, for now and forever, and by your good use of the gift of gramarye you achieved a great quest and proved yourself stronger than the testing. Until we meet again, as meet we shall, we remember you with pride." The far-stretching crowd murmured again a different, warm response. With her thin, small hands, the great rose ring glinting, the lady bent down and set the chain of linked signs around Will's neck. Then she kissed him lightly on the forehead, the gentle brushing by of a bird's wing. "Farewell, Will Stanton," she said. The murmur of voices rose, and the world spun round Will in a flurry of trees and flame, and rising over it all was the bell-like haunting phrase of his music. Louder and more joyful now than ever before, it chimed and rang in his head, filling him with such delight that he closed his eyes and floated in its beauty. It was, he knew, for a crack of a second, the spirit of essence of the light, this music. But then it began gradually to fade, to grow distant and beckoning, and a little melancholy, as it always had before, fading into nothing. Fading, with the sound of running water rising to take its place. Will cried out in sorrow and opened his eyes. And he was kneeling on the cold, beaten snow, in the gray dead light of early morning in a place he did not recognize, beside Huntercombe Lane. Bare trees rose out of pitted wet snow on the other side of the road. Though the lane itself was once more a clear paved road, water ran furiously in either of its gutters, with a sound like a stream, or even a river. The road was empty. No one was anywhere to be seen among the trees. Will could have wept with a sense of loss. All that warm crowd of friends, the brightness and light and celebration, and the lady, all gone, all fled, leaving him alone. He put his hand to his neck. The signs were still there. Behind him, Merriman's deep voice said, "Time to go home, Will." "Oh," Will said unhappily, turning around, "I'm glad you're still there." "You sound most glad," Merriman said dryly. "Restrain your ecstasy, I pray you." Sitting back on his heels, Will looked at him over his shoulder. Merriman gazed down at him with immense solemnity, his dark eyes owlish, and suddenly the emotions were drawn into a tight, unbearable knot inside. Will cracked and broke, and he dissolved into laughter. Merriman's mouth twitched slightly. He put out his hand, and Will scrambled to his feet, still sputtering. "It was just—" Will said and stopped, not quite sure whether he was laughing or crying.